Welcome to the adversity panel, as we're calling it, or entrepreneurship through adversity. Still keeping the ETA theme there. It's the very first one Chicago's done, so really excited to get some great stories, excellent insight. You'll notice Jeff Stevens wasn't able to make it with us, but we've got Matt and Allan here, moderated by Professor Morrissette. Really excited for you guys to dive in and get some perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, first of all, even before we do introductions, kudos to you all to coming to this session. Most young entrepreneurs are rather optimistic and have a biased view of the world. As the three of us were joking, and you can tell all of us maybe perhaps have a few more years of experience than the rest of the audience, that once you're in a company, you learn that it's not if, but when. It's not if you're going to hit a speed bump or some kind of turbulence. It's when you'll hit the turbulence and what kind of turbulence it will be, but you're certainly going to hit turbulence. And to have the skills and perspective to try and weather through that turbulence and redirect through it is something every one of us has to do. I'll say, at least in my case, they're probably more fortunate than me, at least in my case, several times. And so welcome to this session. I will start the introductions. So I'm Steve Morrissette, a professor at Booth. I'm also a search fund investor and have been an angel investor for a decade and a half, I guess, as well as doing startup companies. I've taken 2 companies public and luckily sold them both. So a little bit of my background. Gentlemen, if you'd like, go ahead, Allan.
That's a much cooler resume than mine. I'm Allan Breidenbach. I'm former CEO of U.S. Fence Solutions. I actually came into this business a little bit differently. I was an operator and partnered up with a private equity firm, so kind of came in the market a little bit of a different angle, I suppose. Did my own search for about 6 months. We found the opportunity to start growing U.S. Fence, and in about 21 months, we went from 0 to about 130 million. So we were growing very, very rapidly.
Thank you, Allan. Matt?
My name's Matt Littell. I'm chairman of Progressive Bronze Products. I did a search coming out of Kellogg back in 2007, back when there were about 15 active searches that year. So I think the market's changed a little bit since then, which kind of makes me a dinosaur in this, I guess. Progressive Bronze is a manufacturer of heirloom quality metals. We make and restore all the holy hardware you see in a Catholic church, as well as doing high-end architectural metalworking, things like elevator interiors and exteriors, gourmet kitchens. We do work at Northwestern University of Chicago for offices, that sort of thing as well. I ran the business for 8 years, and last year hired in a president to run the business day to day, and currently still in chairman, and did an add-on acquisition earlier this year, and starting to look at other stuff as well.
So before we get into the notion of adversity, just a little bit more background, because as searchers, it's always sort of interesting to see how people got to where they were and how they made the decisions. So Allan, you started to talk about, so you've been an operator in sort of the related industry for a number of years, and then did you approach a PE firm? Did they come to you? Just talk how you sort of came to your spot.
It depends on who you ask. Yeah, I've been an operator for 20 years. Building products have been my specialty. Had done everything from selling in-home coming out of college for Sears Home Improvements to setting up offices for Home Depot at-home services. Really kind of came at it from the labor side of things, and then started moving into building products. And it was there when I was at Wisconsin Building Supply for a number of years that I became aware of one of the private equity groups that was backing USLBM, and through those relationships I was able to partner up with them and then move into as an operating partner for building industry partners in private equity, and then ultimately finding the U.S. Fence platform.
And so you were in effect an executive in residence. They brought you in. You went out and hunted for them.
Yeah, at the time I wish I knew that I could have that cool of a title.
Great. And you decided straight out of business school to do the search fund route? Correct. So I did a mostly traditional search fund. I raised my fund my second year at Kellogg. I actually worked out of an office space for a couple of my investors. And so I made an arrangement with them to be able to do that, because my background before business school was an operator at GE, doing like Lean Six Sigma and working on acquisitions there, manufacturing mainly, and engineering services. So I hadn't done a transaction. And there wasn't the material that's available now to cover things like letters of intent, indications of interest, and that whole process and how to think about a deal. It wasn't quite as widely, I guess, disseminated as it is now. So that's how I got involved, but it was beyond that, pretty much a traditional search.
Right. Well, so let's turn to the adversity topic then. So I guess we'll start with you, Matt, since you had the ball here. So what are some of the large challenges? I mean, there's a million small challenges that we face in operating a business. What are some of the larger challenges you ran into and the biggest one, and how'd you handle it?
I'll start with three or four, and there's a bunch more. But back when I did my deal, I was searching in 2007, 2008. I signed my letter of intent in March of 2008 and didn't end up closing till December. There were some questions around the environmental status of the business we were purchasing. So we had to do some diligence around that. It took a few months, and along the way, something called the financial crisis happened. So I had like 4 or 5 term sheets from lenders for my original LOI back in March. Come September, October, when I was getting ready to close the deal, the financial world looked a little different at that point. So I ended up having to restructure. Only one lender stayed with me, but under different terms. A number of my equity investors were completely illiquid and unable to invest, even though they could, financially, a year ago would have had no problem, but they weren't going to sell when their portfolio was down 90% or 80% or whatever it was. So I had to go raise additional equity, and oh, by the way, I had to recut the deal with the sellers as well because my financing structure wasn't the same. And at one point, I remember in my office at like 1 a.m. packing up my stuff because I couldn't come to a renegotiated agreement with the sellers, and I was already $100,000 in diligence expenses and thinking, what the hell am I going to do now? The sky's falling. I'm out of money. Really lonely.
The banks have backed away from you.
Yeah.
Some of the investors have backed away from you.
Right. And at the time, I met the woman who eventually became my wife, and I was just thinking about like, how do I go back and tell her I'm done? So that's one.
And so how'd you make it through that then? Let's just stay with that one.
Yeah. So
I feel like I want to give you a hug.
it's funny. Like I put myself back in that place, and it's still an emotional event for me.
Sure.
So like the first thing is like, shit, what am I going to do? And it's like, well, okay, can I get back in this fight? So go home, come back in the next day. I talked to one of my investors. Like, here's the situation. Here's how I see it. Here's all the parameters I've got. Like, am I missing something? Here's the dials I'm trying to pull. So we went and took a look, and like, okay, here's a few more things we could try, and go back and talk to the sellers. Everybody's had a little time to dial back their emotions, and okay, well, if we do this, we can do that, and we pulled some levers, and eventually came to an agreement. And it was a hard battle, but we got there. Similarly, on the equity investor side, okay, well, some of my guys dropped out. Well, if you're out, do you know anybody else who might be interested? And you kind of just you can't eat the elephant in one bite. So you pick off the parts that you can and eventually get to the solution.
And how old are you at this point?
29.
29. And so were your investors, were they helpful at this point?
Yeah, they were really helpful.
Okay, so they provided, frankly, even emotional support?
Yeah, because it's really lonely when you're in at midnight packing up the thing you've been looking at for 9 months going, I'm out of money, they're like, everybody's getting laid off. I can't really go back and ask, can I go back and ask for money, and do I want to? Right. Like, I already have like all these plans to get the business up and running and trying to think through that. It's a really like low emotional place for sure.
Right. Oh, great. Additional challenges, Matt, and then we'll go
sure.
to Allan. Maybe one other large one?
Yeah, one other large one. I mentioned environmental health and safety earlier. The previous owners basically didn't believe in following rules. Long story short, I have several stories around this, but one of them is we're a manufacturer. We make metal products, we polish them, we spray them with a clear coat lacquer. They didn't believe in paying for the proper filters, so in our spray booths, they'd build up about 1.5 inches thick of this lacquer, and on the booths. And I knew it was a problem. We needed to clean this up. I shut down the factory on a Friday. Just had key personnel in there. It's about 8 a.m. I'm in the bathroom. I hear someone run in, yell fire. Make sure nothing's hanging out. Run out into the factory. Figure out what's going on. And like my first question is, like, what's your first question in that scenario? Is anyone dead? That's my first question. And we're in our factory is 30,000 square feet, so twice the size of this building, this room. And the smoke was thick enough that I couldn't see from me to that pillar. And this happened in a minute. So first
How long did you own the company at this point?
9 months? A year, maybe? Something like that.
Doing great.
Yeah. We haven't talked about OSHA and EPA. That happened before that. And so first thing I do is head count. No one's dead. Okay. We're ahead of the game right now. And we had taken a ton of precautions, right? Evacuated the building except for key personnel working on this. Knew where everyone was. Fire extinguishers right in place. Like using the fire extinguishers, it was like trying to use a straw to put out a forest fire. Didn't make a bit of difference. The spray booths were in an enclosed room, steel room with sprinklers. The sprinklers went off. The fire department there was there in like 6 minutes. Thank God, best use of tax dollars ever. And it took. We're on the street that the Wrigley Field is on, so we're on Addison. We shut down the street going to Wrigley Field. I counted 10 fire trucks, over 40 firemen. They almost declared it a hazmat fire, which would have brought the TV copters, because WGN's just down the road from us. Thank God that didn't happen. And so they ended up cutting a 16 square foot hole in the roof, bringing in a fan truck to push the smoke out, and we covered 15,000 square feet with an inch of water from the sprinklers. Takeaways, no one got hurt. All the precautions paid off. So everybody got out, got to the safe place. Firemen came in, like the precautions we took around the room worked. All of our product, no product damaged. We spent all weekend cleaning up and we were back up and running by Tuesday. That was on a Friday. So we found some backup equipment, figure out how can we make this work at least for the time being. Immediately after the fire was put out, the first thing I have to do is go in with inspection with the fire inspector, because they want to go in and see, are we a disaster? Yeah, they're not going to let us reopen.
Not get occupancy.
Exactly. So I remember doing all this, and at like the end of the day, at like 1 a.m. when I left, my hands were shaking from the adrenaline, and I couldn't remember my passcode for the alarm, because like just so much emotion going through that whole time. But like at the end of the day, like you don't see in our financials, we got it back up and running, and I joke that it pays to be in the God business, but there's a little bit of luck involved for sure.
So you were able to get back up and running that fast?
Yeah.
So the spray booths
they were toast. We found some old equipment that we could jury rig and kind of get up and running, and we were slow and it was expensive, but like we got it running. Because we couldn't stop running the business. And it takes months to get insurance and all that stuff. Like we can't shut down for 3 months to get that back up and running. You got to figure out a way to get the job done.
And so at business school, you had taken the advanced course on how to react to disasters and fires.
Yeah, absolutely. That was like that's a key part of the curriculum at Kellogg.
Right. So. I think it is at Booth as well. I think so. We'll come back to learnings. Allan, so what experiences you like to share in terms of surprises and challenges?
I'm feeling conflicted right now. I don't know whether I have a story that I want to try and top that.
Feel free.
I don't know that I want to. I think my experiences have been a little bit more mundane in terms of some of the business challenges that have come through. And what I would share with you guys, I thought the gentleman who spoke this morning said it really well. Probably some of the biggest mistakes that I've made that have created some adversity for me was relying far too much on the spreadsheet and having that become my reality, as opposed to really understanding what the business is and what the people are, how the process works. You mentioned Lean Six Sigma. I got my black belt in Lean Six Sigma and trying to understand process flow and reducing variation. And for me, it was funny that made me move further away from the numbers and more towards the people aspect of the business. The adversity I dealt with singularly was dealing with people and dealing with integration and dealing with change. When you start buying into these lower middle markets, I can tell you many times you have people who aren't ready for change. They're threatened by change. They feel a tremendous investment emotionally and mentally into the business. It defines who they are. And even though you can be very well-meaning when you walk in the door to say, we can make this business better, you can have times, and I had these times, where people felt threatened by the changes you want to make because the roles and responsibilities, hey, that's what I do. And messaging that, trying to deal with the adversity of that, key person risk, bad process, rework loops, were all things that created a tremendous amount of adversity. I think oftentimes the businesses get wrapped up thinking it's people drama, And I think that the people drama was really what drove a lot of the challenges we had as we were on an aggressive growth curve. And you end up treating the wrong symptom as opposed to dealing with the issues. So for me, most of my adversity has been, I don't want to say self-created, but maybe came home from spending far too much time on the financial modeling and not enough time on really what is this business, do I get it, and do I understand where my pain points are.
And you want to walk us through some of the challenges then you've had more recently?
Well, some of them were well lived here as we went through this. When we bought the first platform company under U.S. Fence, it actually came to us in kind of a strange way, as it will, as you go through your search process, as you get the word out there, people are going to start coming to you. And we had a strong relationship with somebody who had won the bid through an investment bank, overvalued it, and was looking to back out from the deal and asked us if we wanted it. And we stepped in and said sure, and relied on a lot of their diligence, which created a major problem for us once we closed. And among those problems were, is I had I won't say any names, but we had a vice president who was in severe emotional distress, and the entire company flowed through her. We had a seller who was unmedicated and bipolar, and created a lot of interesting things, was actively undermining the business and stealing from us, and had to ban him from the facility. We had theft, we had drug dealing going out in the backyard, we had immigration issues that weren't disclosed, we had an ICE lawsuit that we were aware of, but we didn't know it was 13 of our top 20 foremen. When the H-2B visa rules changed under the new administration this year, we lost 30 employees just like that who were expected to be back. So we lost 47 out of 89 guys in the span of 6 days. So from an adversity perspective, you layer that on top with an internal process that wasn't well suited for handling growth, let alone operating at an efficient level. The loss of that skill set out in the field, the people who actually do the job. Take care of your field people, guys. I mean, it's all fun to talk about with the bankers and stuff, but take care of your field guys, because they're the ones who are going to make your money for you as you go through this. But that was our biggest challenge as we went through it. Now, the way we addressed it and overcame it, frankly, was we knew. I was saying this to somebody earlier today, Drew. It may have been you. It's a little bit like if you're driving a car and you look 6 inches in front of your bumper, you're constantly trying to make short-term, quick reactions. Try and look further down the road. Some other guys have said it more eloquently than I in terms of giving yourself a better long-term decision. We knew we wanted to grow the company, so we had already started some of this process to mitigate the key person risk and deal with this. But not unlike your fire situation, it accelerated dramatically on March 26th when we got the word that we were losing all these guys.
And other challenges for you personally from a leadership standpoint, or transitions there, or?
Well, I feel like we're at therapy here.
Well, I mean, your role has changed, right?
Yeah, my role has changed. So, one of the things that I would tell you is, as you go into this, and it might be a little different in your experience, coming at it from a private equity side of things, the lifeblood of private equity is going to be your ability to raise capital. If you think about it in terms of what you're doing in a search fund environment, you're raising capital for what you're doing, and as you have a PE group that's constantly trying to raise funds, it can be a very difficult situation to put the firm in to where you have diligence challenges that didn't reveal the real problem, and then you're going out and asking for more money to invest in another platform. And so ultimately it becomes easier to say, well, we're going to make a management change to see our way through this, because it allows you to explain away perhaps some of the swings and misses that you had. So I was divinely redirected, might be the nice way to say that. Very proud of the work that we've done here. I'm still an equity holder in it, and it's going to be fine. And the guy that we've got in the spot now is going to do an excellent job. And I'm proud of the heavy lift that we had.
So you were owned by one firm, or multiple firms?
Yeah, one firm.
So one firm.
Yeah.
And so how long was your run with them?
It's about 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
And so now they brought another operator who's going to take it to the next step?
Yeah, so like I said, we went from 0 to 130 million in a pretty short period of time. We did 4 acquisitions in the 21 months after we took over. So it was a challenge. Geographically, it was a challenge. It was a challenge in terms of the integration. There was a lack of accounting, a lack of systems, lack of lots of things. I think one of the biggest challenges that can happen is you can tend to gravitate towards things that you like to do as opposed to the things you should be doing. For me, it was easier to gravitate towards the people side and to really solve those issues. Of course, like your fire, you're doing triage medicine at that point in time. But you've got to watch your flank in terms of what you're doing with your finance side of things and make sure that you're taking care of the details.
Well, thank you both for sharing your specific stories. Now, I'd like to just sort of pull it up and say, for our participants who are thinking about, starting to run a company, looking back, if you were sitting in their chairs, what advice would you give them? What preparations can they make? Help them be ready when the day comes.
I guess I'll go first. A couple of things come to mind. I think when I came into this process, I very much underappreciated the importance of timing and luck involved in entrepreneurial success and failure on both sides. Not just with my story, but with some of my friends who have also gone out and done searches as well. Good example is what I mentioned about the trying to close my deal. Right. I didn't control the greater economy, and ultimately I got a deal done, but my timing mattered there. Subsequently, like the business that I bought, the accounting was still done by hand on graph paper with a little ticker tape machine, not even ERP. One person used email, nobody used Microsoft Office. So part of my thesis, and we had 25 years of sales history showing it growing with GDP. So part of my thesis was, there's operational stuff I can do. I don't need to be a rocket scientist to improve how the office functions in financial reporting. And I can make some meaningful improvements here. But then, the world continued to contract, and so I had to deal with the economic repercussions on our business of a contracting market when my financials were 6 months backdated because it took us that long to produce them. So I was kind of playing catch up in the beginning, along with all these environmental health and safety issues I was fighting at the same time. So I think that a couple of things that were helpful for me through this process is one, recognizing that you can have S on your chest and be Superman and be the greatest operator in the world, and you can either have fantastic success with that or run into a wall and have a total failure. For some things outside of your control, that doesn't mean you take your hands off the wheel. It means you got to keep grinding at it, and understanding, being open and transparent and honest with your investors, and having a couple of key people to act as a sounding board, whether it's a partner or an investor or spouse. My wife's a Booth graduate, so she was certainly helpful on a day-to-day basis. But being able to talk through it with someone, because it's also really easy to lock on like, I've got this one problem I'm dealing with, or these 5 problems that are all raging fires right now. But are they, to your point, in the long term, are these where I really should be spending my time? Or can I accept some of these, put a Band-Aid on it and move on to the bigger stuff to keep things going as well?
Let me sort of extract out of your comments there. So first, we need to be aware of timing.
Yeah.
At the end of the, and it could turn out that, whatever stage we're at considering doing this, our timing could end up being good or bad or in between.
Yep.
Right next to that is the more general comment you made that there are going to be variables outside of our control. Right? Timing perhaps being one of them. We ideally, if we're prescient enough, we can see where we are in the cycle, and either in the industry or the macroeconomy. In your case, that was a very big surprise to many participants in the economy. But so timing, there'll be things outside of your control. But then I guess it becomes the third. So then, how do you react to those things? Your comment was you sort of grind through them. You don't.
And also I should add to that, build in some optionality too. Like if there are some things where hey, protect yourself from the really shit show downside. And give up a little upside to do that, because if you're going to be in this for a little while, to protect yourself from a 30% downswing or something, right, it might be worth giving up 5% on the upside, because that gives you, or especially when you're thinking like bank covenants or something like that, you want to make sure that, or you don't cut to the razor's edge so that you have to do everything perfectly, because by definition, most of us who go out and do something like this is the first time, you're going to stub your toe on something, and you need a little bit of breathing room, right, both with a bank or with investors, and manage those expectations accordingly.
Right, and so, so bank covenants, I mean, is the amount of debt going to be a variable where you, by having less debt, you've got more breathing room?
That's one way. Covenants are another way. Making sure your investors, to your point, can provide additional capital so long as you've got a solid plan to work through something. Right. If you have a downturn or need additional capital to seize on an opportunity as well.
Right. Well, to pick up on one of the things I talk about in my courses when I'm talking to students is I want to know how close I am to the break-even stupidity line. How far can things get bad before I've really got a disaster? And if you're only off 5% of your projections and you've got a disaster, that's really close to the stupidity line. If you've got 30% room, that you know what, I can still hold this together even if sales are down 25%, you're not near as vulnerable. Allan, what kinds of advice would you have for the?
Well, I like a lot of things you said there. I think seeking alignment with your investor base to understand how you're going to react to crisis, if and when it should happen, or not if, when it should happen, I think is really critical. How much horizon do you have? What's your runway? And those are really actually easier conversations to have up front than it is once it hits. I think the mitigation of risk is hard for a lot of entrepreneurs. There's a language difference. I mean, I found coming from the operator side, not from the finance side, for me, we kind of missed. I was used to, when you build an organization, you spend a lot of time trying to say, hey, we've got this problem, but we're going to go ahead and do this. And a lot of times your investors want to say, I don't care what you're going to do to give me upside, just make sure that you protect what we have here. And so it's a different language, kind of like what you talked about, is to say, hey, I've got these issues going on, and this is what I'm doing to address it. That language piece was a difference that I found that was there, and I didn't understand that necessarily coming into it. Second thing I would say is, I was talking to a gentleman here earlier this morning when I said, I think some people, when they think about getting into entrepreneurship and owning their own business, there's a fear of taking that leap. I've felt that many times myself in terms of, boy, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to do this? And I've come to find that there's a risk in doing it, and there's a risk in not doing it. And right now you have a lot of years ahead of you that you think, well, I may put this off and I may go ahead and do it, but it's a little weird for me to be sitting up here at 47, sharing stories, because I'm still looking for my mentor, and I consider myself a work in progress. And I wish I knew now or knew 25 years ago what I know now. But guys, to specifically answer the question, Steve, what advice? Do it. You'll make mistakes. It may not look like the other guy did it. I came at it from a different way. You've come at it from a different way. You kind of see the different tracks you can get on. Mm-hmm. But do it. You'll never regret it. And this is coming from a guy who, in 2009, when I was building houses and developing land in Minnesota, I got wiped out. You can recover. Greatest conversation I ever had was with my wife. Somebody said earlier they married up. Well, I really outkicked my coverage. She said, look, you didn't drink it away, you didn't gamble it away, you didn't do this, you just weren't bigger than the whole U.S. economy. Okay. Well, we recovered, and it was kind of interesting. That was the worst thing that ever happened to me. It was my single greatest fear. You overcome it, and you move forward, and we're better off today, financially and as a couple. I mean, how cool is it? You see so many relationships go in the tank, when you have a little bit of financial trouble. But,
Both of you commented on the investor role. I just want to look at that for a second. Sure. So a lot of people say, my experience has been, I've heard some people say that the relationship with your investors or your partners goes great when things are going well. The fights occur when there's too much money on the table or not enough money on the table. And so specifically here when it comes to diversity, at the end of the day, when things go poorly, most human beings need to blame somebody, not even just something, but somebody. And so you both went through situations where sort of somebody had to get blamed, would be the superficial first thought. How did you build a relationship with your investors that maybe avoided that? Or just talk me through how the investor tension went during adversity, unless you were so fortunate there was no tension around it.
I'll jump on that. I think that there's a couple things. One, look to outside objective measures when you can. Are there industry reports? Is there economic data? Is there something you can say, it's not just us? Two, go talk to customers, go talk to suppliers, get additional data. If your investors really want to, take them with you. Like, get them on the call, if they're willing to do that, if there's, questions around that, make sure, get their questions out up front so that you can address it. Don't bury things. Be transparent about it, because, we don't book revenue until it ships. Well, that's ready to ship, so let me book the revenue. Right. Don't do that sort of thing. It's a really slippery slope that gets you in trouble quickly. I mean, those are some of the basic blocking and tackling.
Specifically, are you a tell them early, even though the problem might get fixed, or wait till you think you have it fixed before you tell them you had a problem?
I skew towards the tell them early.
Tell them early.
I try to tell them, I have learned, one of the things I had to mature as a CEO was my first board meeting, I've got a million problems I'm dealing with, and I wanted to talk through them at the board meeting. That's not what my investors showed up for. They're there to make decisions.
They're not there for group therapy.
Right, they're there to make decisions. I couldn't even produce financial statements at our first board meeting. My second board meeting, my car got run over by a tractor trailer and totaled during the board meeting. And at some level, I felt relief.
You really are a lucky guy.
I felt it was metaphorical for what I was feeling.
Just a little bit.
But at the same time, okay, fine. I'm gonna have to go talk to the police when they show up, and I'm gonna step away from the board meeting. Things you never want to say at a board meeting. All kidding aside, I learned that you can tell too early. You don't want to talk about the things that may be problems that aren't, never become problems, because you become the boy who cried wolf. At the same time, as you start to see things happening, here's the 3 paths I can see this going down. If it goes down this path, this is my plan. If it goes down this path, this is my plan. If it goes down this path, this is my plan. So then when they hear, we're going down plan B, they're like, okay, he's at least thought about it. It may not have the full solution, but at least it's not the first time they're hearing about it.
What about you, Allan? At what point in the process do you alert the investors that we've got a challenge?
When it's material. I mean, to me, I think that's the guide. I really like what you're saying here in terms of, you don't want to cry wolf in terms of what you're doing. Transparency is obviously very, very key. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you want to be able to, regardless of what the outcome's going to be able to say, look, I operated with integrity. I made good decisions at the time, and that's always going to be a defensible position to any investor. There's an acceptable level of risk that they're willing to take. If they feel like they're guessing in terms of when they talk to you, or if they feel like they can't get a straight answer. The one thing I would add, I really like your concept about, you're going to have 3 or 4 options to everything that you want to do. Always give yourself more than one option. If you get, what was the line that you used? I hadn't heard that before. The stupidity line?
Oh yeah, break-even stupidity
line. Love that,
line.
the break-even stupidity line. If you have a problem that you can only come up with one potential solution, I suggest before you tell somebody, you think about other solutions.
Yes,
Because it can't be all or nothing in terms of, you're always going to have to move back and regroup or figure out what you need to do. But the one piece I would add is, when your investors tell her, hey, I don't really need to know that, tell them anyway. I have found that a lot of times guys will sit there and say, well, I'm real busy, don't tell me. And then later on it's, why didn't you tell me?
Right.
Well, you told me you didn't need to know. Well, I wanted to know that.
Right.
So rather than guess on that sort of thing, maybe you don't necessarily go run into them every week on a conference call, or, you may save it for the board meeting. It might even just end up being in the notes that you send in terms of an update. But as long as the information gets out there and you continue to tell them, like you have some guys who go, I'm not worried about the accounting stuff, tell me what's going on with sales. You still tell them the accounting stuff.
I agree. That's actually one of the hardest things to learn is, for me, a lot of the investors, time is their most valuable resource, right? And so they don't want to know till they want to know.
Right.
And at the same time, they hired you to do a job. They're not here to run the company. It's your responsibility to make the decisions and filter the information. And it will be idiosyncratic per investor. So I will send a general update to all of my board, all of my investors, but I know certain guys want to know certain things.
Yep.
So I will do a follow-up with just that.
Yep.
And so it's a little learning to play the room as well, I would say.
And so just to build and amplify on that, I mean, the last point that Matt just made is that we talk about the investor as though it's some homogeneous, board. And in reality, we've got 6 or 8 or 5 individuals who all have different priorities, different hot buttons, and to make sure you understand the right communication strategy for each of them, which is not always easy, but it needs to be individualized in that regard. It's not just, well, I might send a group update and I might have a group, just one thing I say, the group in the board meetings, individual board members often have different appetites and priorities as far as the information they get. And the other, obviously, you've alluded to in your comments, is that there's this continuum. On one end, there's an integrity violation where withholding information the board should know. On the other end of the continuum is using the board meeting to whine and get sympathy. In between there, you have to decide your style as a CEO, right? And figure out what it's going to be. I know I'm a disclose early person, but I also know that, I think, as you've both alluded to, my job is to come to them with solutions, not problems. And so I'm going to come to them early, but already, as you said, both of you said, with an eye towards solutions.
Sorry about that.
You know, if I can ask Steve, I think there's one other piece to this that in some ways can actually be even a little more difficult to navigate, particularly when you're first getting going. I know I had some challenges with it. In an eagerness to disclose and to share the information, sometimes you can get investors who become a little activist on you, and they start really wanting to tell you how to do things day to day, and then all of a sudden that boundary starts to blur, and that can be a real challenge, knowing how to walk that line and where to walk that line. I don't have a good answer in terms of what your guide should be on that, but it is something to watch out for in terms of, you know, your job is to run that business day to day and to make good decisions and bring information to them and help them guide it. But as soon as the board starts trying to run the business day to day, you're in for a whole different experience.
Yeah, and, you know, that would be a whole nother panel discussion, you know, on its own. I would say that one of the things I like, one of the things I like about the search fund model, I've worked with a lot of different boards, either as the CEO or as a fellow board member and investor. And the search fund board community is a sophisticated, competent community in terms of they're good owners, generally speaking. And you, many of you know that obviously already, but compared to some others where it's 5 guys in a real estate deal or 3 other angels that are staking you, these are all people that they've been through the cycle a couple times and are generally speaking pretty good directors because, yeah, I mean, in any situation, you can have directors that become problematic for a variety of reasons.
Sure.
Right?
Right, absolutely.
Coming back to the adversity thing, one of the things we heard a couple times today is the idea of not wanting to work for the man, the buck stops here, et cetera. So one of the attractions, obviously, of the search fund model and becoming a CEO is you get to run your own shop. And that's great when things are going well, okay? But when all heck is breaking loose and the factory's burning down and suddenly you've got a merger that's not going well and the investors want to change horses, whatever, at that point, having the buck stop with you isn't quite as much fun as it was, in the billboard. How did that feel when you got to the point where suddenly now, this again is sort of like your problem, your fault. There's nobody up the line to sort of pass the buck to and to look to for solutions. The downside of having the buck stop with you, what's your thoughts or experiences around that side of it?
Well, it's going to happen. Yeah, it's I don't remember if it's Godfather 1 or Godfather 2. Am I the only one who knows that movie? It might be of a certain age here. This is the profession we have chosen. I think the thing that's a little bit different is you can have all sorts of things that happen to you through the course of your career that may or may not be your responsibility. But if you're going to take the rewards that go with it, you're going to have to take the risk that goes with it. And I think anybody, like you just made the comment here, experienced players in the industry are going to understand it. It's not something that you need to run from. It's the nature of the beast. And I think if for me, as the decision was made to change horses, I don't mean this dismissively to it. I mean, there's no doubt it's not always your first choice in terms of what you want to have happen. But it was something where there was no question of integrity, there was no question of effort, there was no question of anything other than the situations in terms of what came up. I understood why it was being done, and so in some ways that can make it be a little bit easier. But it's if you're working through tough times, at least for me, I don't want to speak for you, I would much rather be in control of that point and take the ramifications that come with it than being sitting back and having it dictated to me.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I'll tell my employees is like, look, don't feel sorry for me. If I want the title on the board, it's my problem. I took that with the job. But I expect that of them too. So if you want that promotion, recognize, it comes with more money or more prestige or whatever, but it comes with accountability too. It works for me, it works for you. And so, understanding that and being accepting of the fact that, most of the folks here are super successful, valedictorians, etc. You are going to fail at something in this job. And
Several things.
More than one thing, most likely. But you need to be comfortable with, okay, you're going to fail at something and you're going to learn from it and you're going to move on. And, how do I get back in the fight? And if you can't and that could ultimately be the entire business. You could think that you're on the one end, since we're concentrating on adversity. But you need to get comfortable with the fact that there are going to be things that are right that are not going to work out the way you expected.
I almost think of it sometimes this way. I don't know if you've thought about this. Sometimes you're going to have to make choices where one is just less wrong than the other.
Absolutely.
You're just kind of going, I got two bad choices, and one's just a little less bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you may emotionally not want to do it, but but you've done the math or you've done the work, and this is the right decision. I've got to do it.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot with personnel.
Right. Yeah, people issues. Well, why don't we, in the few minutes we have left, see what questions you all have. I hope we haven't scared you too much.
This is not at all depressing.
I would say, with all that said, I'd do it again.
Yep.
That's right.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks, all. Quick question on Matt. When you brought in equity investors for the second round, how did you convince them to come in? Was it a different valuation? I mean, everybody was feeling the crunch, so curious how that conversation went.
So basically, I already had an LOI. We had already kind of pre-baked what the terms looked like, and it was a warm introduction from some of my investors. So for me, it wasn't that difficult. And it was more like, I got the warm introduction, talked to them, got a little background on them, they got a little background on me. We both made our own phone calls to kind of do some reference checking, and we're good. But I did, I'm not doing $1 billion deal, right? And I wasn't if I was going to bring in additional capital, I wanted to do it on the same terms. I didn't want to have Class A and Class B.
Because this wasn't another round. This was still
this was the first round.
This is the first round.
So
right.
it was more a matter of
everybody got the same deal.
Yeah, everybody gets the same deal, and we're going to be transparent up front, and that's how I like to operate. I'm not going to have two tiers of shareholders if I don't have to.
Good. Other questions for Matt or Allan? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm curious about. I remember 08, 09. We didn't know it was going to be as bad, and I'm curious how you kept the seller engaged when you had to go back to them and tell them their company was worth less. I mean, obviously, you did the deal, but I'm curious on those details.
So in our scenario, our original plan was to buy the business and the building. We had a divergent view of the real estate market. So we ended up having to recut the deal, and what actually ended up saving it is we figured out a lease structure that worked so that we didn't have to buy the building. But the owners, the owner had cancer. They were living in Florida. He was checked out. My handover was literally 12 hours, less than 12 hours, 8 hours, because he had to go deal with his cancer. So they were kind of off living in Florida. And so that was a lot of the conversation around have you picked up a newspaper? I'm not the only one saying
he had other
this.
things to worry about, yeah.
Right, but you need to realize what's going on in the world. I'm not trying to recut a deal and screw you. Look at the headlines. The world is changing. It's not the same.
Ending.
Right, and so a lot of it is bring a third party in if you can. So it's not just you saying it, but it's some other reputable source. And that's actually where a broker or banker can be helpful or hurtful. In my case, my broker, their broker, was hurtful. He was denying the fact that this stuff was going on and pumping them full of, and this is where bad advice kills deals. Oh, he's just trying to screw you. Dude, look at the stock market.
Yeah.
You kidding me, right?
It's better in the real estate market.
Right. Ultimately, the cancer, I think, pushed them over the finish line because what's their next best option?
Right.
Along with a lot of coaxing from me and also getting close enough with them to where they saw me almost as a surrogate. And so they felt an emotional connection to hey, they wanted me to succeed with this as well.
Any other questions for Matt or Allan? Yes.
You guys talked about managing adversity with your investor base, internally when you're going through that. What about your employee base when you're 9 months into your company? They don't even know you, right? So how do you establish that trust and that, same goes if half your workforce leaves.
Sure.
They don't know you either, right? So
Right.
how do you gain that trust and move forward?
You want to go first? Or want me to?
You go for it.
All right. For me, it was really about having that direct relationship with the employees. there's no question trust becomes the single biggest thing in terms of what you can build with your employee base. We had 150 employees, of which 89 were going out in the field every day. We had about 130 at that point. And then sales staff and internal staff. And oftentimes it becomes easy to walk around in terms of the internal staff. At this particular company, we were installing fences throughout the Denver area. So for me, it was literally helping load trucks in the morning, going out to the job sites, and making a big deal out of, I don't want to say poking fun at the boss, but kind of being more of a human side with them. We had a woman who brought her dog to work every day for 20 years, not the same dog, but brought a dog. And Zeus is Alex, you've seen him, 110-pound German Shepherd, and he was kind of our security system. If he liked you, you were okay, and if he didn't, you should probably leave. And she was terrified that I was going to say he can't come in anymore. And I said, absolutely, he needs to keep coming in. So for me, it was about building trust to allow them to do that, and it was more about making the individual relationships. I think we touched on it earlier, kind of tailoring your message to the individual investor. There's some of that. You should know kids and spouses and what's going on and all the basic tenets of a good relationship, so that despite doing all of that, you're still going to be the boss man. And it's kind of their God-given right to complain about you. So you're going to have some of that as it goes along anyway. But sometimes they can take real comfort in the fact that knowing you're there and you're making the decisions. And if they believe in you and know you, I think it becomes a little bit easier to navigate the tough times. And then you have to be honest with them to the point that they get what you're trying to do, but I would say you break it down for them in a way that makes more sense. So for example, I wouldn't go to my labor staff and say, geez, guys, we're falling out of our covenants here because our AR is getting out of compliance. I mean, that's not a discussion that they're going to be able to put into any sort of context. But I could say to them, guys, we got to make sure our quality's right so we can collect the check right away and make sure we can get paid for what we do. We don't want to have to chase this down the road. Well, now there's their piece that they can glom onto, and then I can have a more in-depth conversation with the AR side to say, this is the piece that you have to own to help us through this.
Great. Anything, Matt?
I'd agree with all that. A couple of things. One, try and follow through on what you say you're going to do.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Because you're establishing whether you're a liar or telling the truth early on. Mm-hmm. So try and do that, and try and find some early wins to make their lives easier. It may not be the most important thing for the business immediately, but like, hey, the Coke machine's broken. It's been broken for 2 years. Get a new freaking Coke machine. Like, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it shows you're listening. And if you can do, or more importantly, if you can find somebody who's respected and you can make their job better, all of a sudden, they talk, right? And you start to get more credibility, and they're more likely to listen to you when you come into their area because, oh, hey, so-and-so's saying, the boss was in there helping, and like, get dirty. Like, this is I never dress like this at work. I work in a factory. I'm wearing a sweatshirt and jeans and tennis shoes. Like, don't be afraid to get in there and learn the job, because it shows that you're not too good to do anything.
And admit a mistake if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if you made a decision, it didn't work out so well, go ahead and say, hey, I blew it. You're modeling kind of the thing that you want them to do too.
Absolutely.
They'll trust you more when you do that as well.
Absolutely.
Well, great. We very much appreciate, it's easy to come up here and talk about how everything went well. It takes a little more willingness to share, to discuss some of the challenges you had. So I really appreciate both of you being willing to help our participants by sharing through some of the challenges you had, and congratulations on surviving them. So join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much. I feel like I need a drink. Thank you. Oh, I know. Thank you very much.
Well done, man.
Yeah.